When rumors started to pick up about a possible RE4 remake, I always thought it had the potential to surpass the original in a lot of ways. The original Resident Evil 4 was a serious departure from classic survival horror. Led by series creator Shinji Mikami, RE4 would push the GameCube to its limits and change gaming forever. Coming off the Resident Evil 2002 remake, Resident Evil 4 was an extremely unique game for the time. It would spawn an entire generation of copy-paste third-person shooters, but none of them quite had the charm of the original Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 was in development hell for a period of time. It was eventually split into two games, the RE4 that we know today and Devil May Cry, both highly influential in gaming. Devil May Cry became a spin-off because developers felt the game was straying too far from what Resident Evil was all about, which is ironic because both games have a ton of similarities, graphically, the narrative, and the over-the-top anime persona of the main character. I remember the first tease for RE4 being in a Game Informer around 2002, simply a black 4 in the Resident Evil 4 font on a single page. Resident Evil was well established at the time. The GameCube sort of had an exclusivity deal. Resident Evil 2002 Remake, Resident Evil 0, and the ports of classic RE2 and RE3. The GameCube was arguably the place to play Resident Evil. Hype for Resident Evil 4 was brewing, but the series was also drawing criticism from journalists. The core mechanics that make survival horror what it is were solidified in the late 90s. A dark, brooding atmosphere, fixed or cinematic camera angles, resource management, backtracking, and puzzle solving. Capcom had a winning formula. It would even go on to inspire Konami to take a chance on a dev team full of randoms, who would go on to create one of the most compelling and well-written games ever developed, Silent Hill. Silent Hill borrowed many of the core traits established in the Resident Evil series, except they would focus more on the narrative, an artistic, melancholic, introspective masterpiece, pushing the limits of storytelling in a video game. The question, are video games art, was proven in that series. And Resident Evil had a lot to do with it. Resident Evil was more about gameplay in a lot of ways. No one ever compared Resident Evil's narrative to mid-century Russian philosophy, but the series had atmosphere and addictive gameplay. Not everybody was happy though. Journalists felt a change coming in the air. The next generation of kids were already starting to lose focus, low attention span. Slow, methodical gameplay with backtracking and puzzle solving wasn't it anymore. It seemed Shinji Mikami was ahead of the curve. Maybe he was feeling it himself. Maybe it was pressure from the suits at Konami. Maybe he actually had an exaggerated role in its development. Either way, RE4 was coming. It was like a bullet through a glass house when it hit. Resident Evil 4 was a very different kind of game from its predecessors. Let's call it what it is. It's a third-person action shooter, and RE4's influence on gaming is still felt to this day. 7th Gen was littered with soulless copy-paste shooters all desperately trying to ride RE4's wave. But to be fair, some really great games came out of that influence. Dead Space and The Last of Us both come to mind. Unfortunately, Resident Evil would fall into a slump artistically. Resident Evil 5 and 6 did huge numbers for Capcom, but a significant portion of the fan base could feel the lack in creativity. It would be more about securing that addictive gameplay that shooters brainwash you with, instead of trying to create a unique artistic experience. We wouldn't see another attempt at survival horror until Resident Evil 7, which was ironically led by key developers of Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 7 was sort of a revival for the series, a masterpiece in its own right. Capcom would start remaking classic RE titles with modern shooting mechanics created by the original Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 2 and 3 both got modern remakes. Resident Evil 2 was generally accepted by the entire fan base, while RE3 was a soulless cash grab that didn't attempt to honor the original in any way. Glorified DLC, in all honesty, a complete and utter disappointment and disgrace. Resident Evil 8 released and sort of felt like it was a step back from Resident Evil 7. A lot of the more action-oriented sections of RE4 could be felt inside the game. Some people even said it felt like a test run for a possible Resident Evil 4 remake. But did RE4 really need a remake? Its gameplay honestly still holds up in the modern era. It's not like remaking classic RE2 for the kids who only understand the video game language of modern shooters. So that brings us to now. RE4 Remake is out, The dust has settled, people have finished their gameplays, speedrunners are breaking it to pieces, people are working on their 100% and platinum trophies. How did Resident Evil 4 Remake turn out? You might be thinking I'm an RE4 hater, but you would be wrong. I've played every Resident Evil on release since Director's Cut in '97. Resident Evil was a game I learned video game language with. The reading, the puzzle solving, the critical thinking. Playing Resident Evil games in elementary school before social media and high-speed internet was a very different experience than today. You spent months in the game's world and environment trying to piece it all together. It was a unique time in gaming. Trying to get immersed in a modern game like that today just isn't the same. I think RE4 Remake does a decent job in this respect. RE4 Remake is not a one-to-one remake. They cut out a lot of the bloated fat of OG RE4 and created a game with really good pacing.
I like this stuff.
The gameplay sections flow and never really feel tired or annoying. I genuinely never felt like it was dragging on, which is a huge problem with modern games. RE4 Remake has fluid and fun gameplay mechanics. Simple quality of life improvements like being able to move and shoot really help take RE4's core gameplay to another level. Resident Evil 4 Remake also added stealth and parry mechanics. This helps the player create unique and interesting combat scenarios. Chaining fun combos and basically running circles around enemies is a lot of fun. RE4 was never afraid to just throw tons of enemies at you in awkward situations. But in the remake, it feels like you have more room to breathe. I've seen people online complaining about some of the character designs. Leon is pretty much a one-to-one. He's the same over-the-top main character in anime that he was in OG, but things were dialed back a bit. RE4 Remake is a more serious game tonally, and this is reflected in the characters. Ashley, for example, had a major rework. Instead of being an annoying teenager, she comes off more like a sophisticated young adult. The 70s style orange jacket, the equestrian horse riding fashion with the brown knee-high boots, the early 2000s layering trend with the turtleneck and scarf, even down to the plaid skirt. She looks great. And her personality fits the tonal shift as well. She comes off cute and encouraging, optimistic and reliable. The way she flirts with Leon is so subtle and realistic. They really did a great job with her design. Almost like they considered the fact that people who played the original on release would be older now. It is pretty much the same story with Ada. I've seen the most complaints towards her rework online. To be honest, I don't agree. Her new outfit is sexy and practical. You wouldn't be running around Eastern Europe in a ballroom dress and heels. A girl like Ada can make anything look good. It's in the eyes and attitude. Red turtleneck with tight black pants and boots, it's definitely working for me. On the topic of voice acting, I really think people should try to play in Japanese, with subtitles. It's almost like, and hear me out, it was intended to be that way. Especially Leon with his over-the-top anime persona and chiseled anime jawline. His interactions with Ashley just work in Japanese. Resident Evil 4 also expanded on the lore in a lot of ways. I felt like I was finding unique and interesting files around every corner. Whether it was something left behind by a cult member describing their religious devotion, or somebody talking about letting the black oil take them, castle workers, diaries, and journals, it all adds to the world building and immersion. OG RE4 was lacking in this department. Something like 15 unique files that actually had something interesting to say. It comes back around to that tonal shift that I described. Resident Evil 4 Remake feels much more like a survival horror game than OG RE4 did. But that's not to say Remake does everything better. I found myself unmoved by the original soundtrack of the remake. The game's core sound design is amazing, but I wasn't noticing any standout musical pieces. Save room themes are an iconic and important piece of the Resident Evil formula. So much emotion and power is created in those motifs. All the music in RE4 Remake felt washed out and spacey, typical for a modern game, to be honest. I also like the chanting from the cultists in OG RE4 a lot more. RE4 had a very distinct atmosphere and vibe. The PS2 textures, the lo-fi audio files, and the way it's all mixed together, that old PS2 color palette, goes back to why I said the copy-paste shooters could never match its charm. The PS2 Capcom Konami era was like lightning in a bottle. Hardware limitations were really driving creativity at the time. But overall, I'd say they did a pretty good job with the remake. I can't think of anyone that expected it to be a one-to-one. I personally wasn't really sure what to expect. I think it's the best Resident Evil game since 7, and I give it an honest 8 out of 10. Better than 7? No. Better than 8? Yes. Much, much better than the remake of 3, but not quite a 10 out of 10. Like, something like the 2002 remake could be considered a 10 out of 10. Silent Hill 2 is a 10 out of 10. I would really like to see Capcom take risks and get back to the roots of survival horror. Assuming they stay on the remake trend, I'm hoping it's not Resident Evil 5. Code Veronica could benefit from the RE2 remake treatment. Even something like Outbreak could be interesting. There's a lot of possibilities with that kind of multiplayer aspect. If you made it this far in the video, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.